WWT presents Briefings.
Well, thank you all for joining today. The topic we will be discussing is unified SASE and what happened to SASE and SSE. And before we really get into that, I did want to do a quick introduction. My name is Brianna Farrell. I am a technical solutions architect here at WWT, primarily focused on SASE and SSE. However, I do have a pretty extensive background when it comes to security and also network architecture. Prior to being here at WWT, I was in professional services for quite a long amount of time. So I do have quite the grasp around other components of an architecture and the importance of how they intersect. And I also, on a personal note, I really do enjoy going on, I would call it explorations of the Georgia state parks, but you may also catch me playing Fallout on my free time. But other than that, I'm pretty much just somebody that loves talking security. And feel free to follow me on LinkedIn if you want to just kind of track along some of the content and some of the information around the SASE and SSE space. And it would also be good to note too that I come from a very diverse and unique team called GSNA Secure Edge. And I just want to give them a shout out just simply because they also are speaking the gospel of SASE and SSE. And a lot of the content I'll be sharing with you today was pretty much came out of each one of my colleagues as well. So wanted to give them a shout out. And if you ever want to track what they're up to, you can definitely check them out on LinkedIn, or you can even look on the platform and be able to follow what they're up to as well. So the agenda today is really just to discuss a couple of topics before kind of leading up to what is unified SASE. The first real topic will be how everything is pretty much everywhere. And then, of course, we'll start to talk about WWT's view of unified SASE and SSE. And then really get into some of these business drivers that a lot of organizations are interested in and looking towards the future in modernization. And then how can WWT help and with that journey? And then, of course, we'll have a conclusion after. Now, the everything is everywhere is kind of a bold statement. I think it is actually true. When we think about the way the network is headed in this space from a security standpoint, our consumers is what we would like to call them now, aren't just your regular users who are just sitting on the network, probably at a branch office. These are also people that are remote. These could be headless devices. It could even be sensors. Essentially, that is kind of why we're calling them consumers, because they are basically consuming that connectivity. They're consuming that capability to be able to reach their destination. And that services is no longer just an application in a data center. So those consumers are constantly trying to reach that service, which could be a data storage in the cloud. It could be a data center in a colo. It could be applications that are in the cloud. They can be applications in a data center. Irregardless, those consumers are trying to reach the services. But the problem with this now that we're facing is our traditional idea of let's build that great wall of firewall to prevent some of this from at least some of the insider threats is no longer going to keep up with the attack surface. And so as we continue to grow and expand our need to get to these services, these threats are getting larger, more complicated. And honestly, it's starting to get a little scary out there with some of the capabilities around AI in particular. So why am I telling you all of this? It's not to scare you. It's really just to kind of set the scene where we're at, where we're headed, and what we need to be prepared for. And that is why it's important we start to think about how did we evolve from in a network security view to get to this point where we are looking towards architectures like SASE or unified SASE. I think it's important we actually kind of pay homage to that traditional network, especially since I think we're looking at this image and we're thinking, wait a minute, is that a hub and spoke? And I don't mean to trigger anybody who has had to deal with that as a network professional, but we probably have deployed this. We probably had taken exams or certifications on this. But the point I'm trying to make in this traditional architecture is that the original intent was to put that firewall as close to the applications as we could, or as close to our services as we could, which is an on-prem data center within a traditional network. The problem that we were facing is now we've got these branch users or even remote users who are trying to reach those applications. It's all funneled through the data center. So effectively, that data center, that physical on-prem data center, has become the center of the universe. But the problem with this is honestly poor user experience, because now they're not having the capabilities, especially when they're remote, to get to that application or service without having to go through your data center. Effectively, you're having to create a ton of backhauling to get that internet traffic to the DC. So again, this is probably a little older, a traditional approach. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist anymore, but I would say the next model that we see more of our organizations currently in is a distributed DMZ model. Now, this one we're probably aware of, we're probably in it, is really those firewalls or the security stack is we're trying to get as close to the user as possible. So it made perfect sense that we put those firewalls at those branch locations as opposed to putting them in the data center to try and effectively reduce that backhauling, but also to give it so that the users are able to have a better user experience. So essentially, and that's not even just for branch users, it could be for remote users. However, this also comes with issues. This could have higher costs. There's higher risk to exposure of threats because now you're contending with, yes, you have better user experience, but now you're having to deal with management overhead. You're having to deal with a lack of a centralized view. So that visibility and having to maintain that is probably complicated. So that's kind of what really kind of turned the light bulb moment on about what is SASE. Could this be an opportunity that we look at when we're thinking about evolving our network to be a little bit more user friendly and visibility? And that's kind of really what started the idea of SASE. Now, this next slide, you kind of see I jokingly call it the SASE pizza wheel. So really just think of the left side of it as the WAN toppings of that pizza or the network WAN edge. And then the right side is that security service edge. And this is those, I would jokingly call it the SSE pizza toppings. But what I'm trying to get at is essentially both of these titans, the network and the security, come together. They essentially create that SASE pizza party, if we want to call it something corny, to be able to have it all under one pane of glass, to be able to have both of these architectures delivered from the cloud with the overall goal is to reduce the network and security silos. Because historically speaking, it has been a problem in the past with having the network side and the security side of the architecture bridging those gaps, making sure that those are fundamentally working together and not against each other. And I also think it's important not to continue making a corny food analogy. ZTNA is a big component of SASE. It is something that is throughout the entire solution because what it does is it's providing that extra layer of user access and being able to make sure those users are only accessing the systems that they're able to access. Essentially making sure that that user is authenticated, it's verified, and that they can only reach where they're supposed to reach while making the rest of the areas of that network opaque to them. So this is just, think of this as a very unique, interesting architecture that gives you more visibility, but it also gives you a better security and network ecosystem. And as you notice at the end of this image, there's network as a service and security as a service. The cool part about SASE is it really plays into that as a service model. So when you're thinking as an organization where to start here, you have options because you don't necessarily have to turn every single feature on to start your journey with SASE because of that as a service, consume what you need model. So let's drill in a little bit now into security services edge. You probably have seen a ton of marketing around this, especially because of recent Gartner reports and even OEMs in this space that are calling themselves SSE. really think of SSE as the security stack of a full SASE architecture. And why is SSE really important beyond the obvious, oh, it's the security frameworks? It's an easier way for a starting point for organizations to transition to a full SASE architecture, especially if they're thinking of becoming a more cloud native approach or just having cloud native initiatives. And you could even really consider a tool set reduction here, or there's maybe capabilities to build a bigger and larger ecosystem with tools you already have in play. Because what's really interesting about the Security Service Edge or SSE is being able to grow your tool sets with what's already in play here. And I always also joke that SSE, where did that A go? And you probably could look at an article that I have actually wrote about this. SSE does have a little A as the running joke that I have on my team. It's giving you more access capabilities, but it's not going to be a full SASE architecture unless you do have an SD-WAN or MPLS component to this. But I just wanted to highlight, don't get confused. It's just the security stack of a full SASE architecture, and that it is an entry point into your journey to get to a SASE architecture. Now, with all that said, what the heck is unified SASE then? And I know it's probably like, oh, great, more SASE concepts that I have to understand. Why is there so much marketing? I don't want you to think that way. This is actually a really good thing, because with the rise in popularity of SASE, it definitely came out that there's some areas that needed to be matured, especially when bridging the network and security capabilities together. So there's a couple of reasons why the space needed to evolve, but one of the biggest reasons was trying to find a way not just to reach that path to SASE, that full architecture, but what's unique in this unified SASE approach to this is, in even looking at this image, you really are becoming more unified, essentially thinking about that single pane of glass. You truly can get that with a unified approach, because now you're getting the network and security architecture visibility, but now they're cohesive and they can operate under one policy, effectively simplifying management, but also enhancing that user performance. And it's giving you the capabilities to even have that as a service model in a different light of this, because of all of the different features you have to choose. And again, it's under one policy. So now that we kind of have that definition a little bit better of what is unified SASE, let's talk about the different SASE components to the solution. Now, again, another food reference. I jokingly call these Nikki's mini pizzas. A colleague of mine actually wrote a great article on building a SASE architecture to achieve a unified SASE, and I will share that URL later in this presentation. But anyway, I think it's safe to say that when we think of SASE, we typically are thinking of that single vendor solution model or the multi-vendor model. And let me preface that both of those are still very effective and popular solution models. I do think it's important, though, that we mention that that single vendor SASE doesn't necessarily mean it's unified. Some OEMs in this space are still working towards a truly unified solution and or they're just simply planning to stay within that single vendor or multi-vendor approach. So what are the true benefits, though, of a unified SASE model, and can we talk through each of those? Well, the first one, let's kind of look at multi-vendor for a minute. The benefits of that is, honestly, you have flexibility to really migrate, add, or change components within that model, because it really is built around APIs. And that, of course, means you can have a tailored solution. And so what are the benefits then of a single vendor? Well, now you actually get to have one vendor support, single purchase orders, and probably a little bit more simplified licensing. So what are the real differences then, even though it's two different vendors for multi-vendor and then single vendor? What's really the considerations, I think, here that will really help set this apart would be You still might be contending with fragmented policies because remember, in a single vendor and multi-vendor, they really aren't sharing that management plane necessarily, or even the data plane. So thinking about that management complexity, that still unfortunately can be seen in either of these two solution models. And siloed visibility. Of course, you can look at options within each of these to enhance that. However, when we look at a unified SASE model, the benefits really do showcase themselves. You'll be able to have more of that streamlined operation, increased clarity, and you'll have that one pane of glass with the same vendor, and you actually will be able to see a less of a siloed visibility into that. Now, the considerations here, the really big one that I want you to remember is we're still watching this mature. There's a lot of OEMs in this space that are still developing and maturing. So you'll really need to understand your specific business requirements to make sure that whichever option you do choose, whether it's single, multi, or unified SASE, that it's meeting your needs. It's meeting what you're attempting to do. And then this is something too that my team, myself, are more than happy to talk through because again, this is an ever evolving space and it can get confusing sometimes. And of course, not to throw another solution model in, they recently also released what's called sovereign SASE. So this is really that unified SASE delivered through more of that private infrastructure. But keep in mind that when you're considering this solution, this is really something for highly sensitive environments that want to pursue a unified SASE path, but they require significant control around their private infrastructure. So with sovereign SASE, there is a lot of custom capabilities, data control, and ownership. However, this offers you also the capability to have this be on-prem and not have it just be cloud only. Now, there are some considerations to think about when researching all of these solution models that I laid out. Is this particular sovereign SASE does have some complexity with management overhead. Because remember, when you start adding more complicated custom services, for example, your management overhead increases. And later in this presentation, I will make sure to show a wonderful article that covers this topic. And that way you can dive deeper into this if this is an interest to you. Now that we kind of covered the history and the understanding of what's SASE, what's SSE, and now there's unified SASE, here are some of the business drivers that here at WWT, we've actually seen with a lot of organizations become very popular when they're considering SASE and SSE. And in particular, I would actually like to cover and highlight the agility and scalability as well as risk management. Now for agility and scalability, this is where actually I talk a lot with organizations. And mostly it's around evolving their hybrid workforce for a better user experience, but also a consistent secured experience. And this also can turn into conversations around that third party access, like contractors. And then another very popular business driver is that risk management. This is where we want to reduce that attack surface. And this is a huge topic right now, especially with organizations concerned with those threats that are out there. And remember, everything is everywhere now. There are tons of devices that need to have protection around and to prevent having any lateral movement, to prevent having any sort of data integrity being lost. So this is where the conversations typically tend to go to zero trust and segmentation, which are huge topics that SASE and SSE do offer. And now I wanted to kind of drill in a little bit to one of those business drivers, which is risk management.
This episode is brought to you by Netskope, a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for Security Service Edge 3 years in a row, and debuting as a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for Single Vendor Secure Access Service Edge in 2024. Netskope helps organizations apply zero trust principles and AI ML innovations to protect data and defend against cyber threats.
And I'm sure we all have heard at least the numerous news stories about data breaches, due in part thanks to those malicious attackers. But there have been recent breaches from employees who are purposefully leaking sensitive data. Like, for example, shown here, you're seeing a military airman who was caught mishandling very sensitive government information. So how do we stop that? Well, with Zero Trust Network Access, or ZTNA, it is an important framework within SSE and SASE. ZTNA works really by enforcing those strict access controls based on principles of never trust, always verify. So the users or devices are continuously not just being authenticated and authorized, but they're making sure that they are permitted to get to that specific application or resource, regardless of where that user's location is, whether they're remote or on-site. So in short, ZTNA within SASE ensures that secure, granular access to those resources while preventing unnecessary exposure to sensitive data. And looking at that statistic that you see on your screen, zero trust can actually reduce the cost of those data breaches. So not only are you mitigating the risk, but you're also preventing costly fixes, so to speak. But it gets even better. SSE offers additional frameworks that work in conjunction with ZTNA. If you look at the bottom of the screen underneath the solution features, SSE offers posture checking, microsegmentation, site-to-site segmentation that also further reduces that attack surface and prevent those malicious actors. Because what you're essentially doing is you're reducing the exposure of those compromised workloads, compromised users, and to really prevent that lateral movement. And did I mention that this can all be under one single policy? Effectively, I guess it's important to say, SSE and SASE can improve not just your overall zero trust footprint, but it can also improve that security visibility, and you can consolidate a lot of these services and streamline them into a real-time monitoring across all users, all devices. And so now that we kind of have an understanding of how risk management is a huge driver, what are some of the other benefits that we are seeing with clients using SASE and SSE? Well, I wanted to highlight a couple of them, especially the digital experiencing monitoring. I think one of the things, coming from a space where I was a security engineer for years, deploying a lot of what I'm talking about, it was very hard when you're trying to understand insight, when you're trying to get context of what's going on your network, and what is not just the performance, but how are my users being affected? Are they being affected at home? Are they being affected on site? Is it a security issue? Is it a network issue? Is it an issue even with their ISP at home? So that digital experience monitoring can give you that granular detail, which would have been helpful when you're troubleshooting a user who's working from home, to be able to say, hey, your ISP is having issues. So having that alone, that is just an amazing tool to have from an administrative point of view. And it also can increase and improve user experience, because a lot of these digital tools are also creating and integrating analytical data. So it becomes more predictive. It becomes more intuitive to be able to create policies, or to even help troubleshoot and isolate those issues, preventing them from getting further. And another area too that I think is important, kind of in that same space, is consolidation. A lot of organizations may be experiencing technical debt. And what I mean by that is not just hardware, but you may have software, or you may have tools, security tools like DLP, like Secure Web Gateway, that are siloed. So in a sense, your network is not just segmented by users, but it could be segmented by tools. And so to be able to consolidate your tools by looking towards some of those frameworks in SSE that, like DLP, like Secure Web Gateway, you'll be able to really increase that ecosystem that we're trying to build in an architecture so that you're no longer siloed with your tools. So again, this also goes back into that digital experience monitoring and visibility, because you're now able to see all of this closer into one single pane of glass. And then finally, I think it's important to say you're going to have a centralized management too. So again, as an administrator of this, it is an amazing tool to have because you can see it all. You can make configuration changes. You can actually do troubleshooting without having to run around in different windows. And also, again, remember, SSE is a security stack of SASE. So not only are you getting all of these benefits, but from an SSE point of view, but you get those as well from a SASE, a unified SASE point of view. And a lot of these benefits are continuing to grow as well. And it's because these are just probably like a small footprint of the possibilities you have. So how are we able to really understand how the SASE and SSE OEM landscape here at WWT? Well, because of our research and insights. First and foremost, our partnerships with all of our go-to-market OEMs, we hold regular meetings. Our strategic partners help us also assess their solution, so it's really creating that partnership. But we're also aware of those new features that are coming out, those roadmap items that are giving us those unique insights, because again, when you look at this image, you see the tree beginning to grow. That's very important to us as part of our research and insights, is understanding from a OEM heritage standpoint how they started. Did they start as a firewall company and then they have now organically grown into an SSE OEM? Those are very important when you're thinking of scalability, when you're thinking of future. And also, we're really leveraging something very unique to WWT, which is our ATC. We're able to get that rigorous testing of solutions that also comes into our research and insights, because we are able to score criteria around that in our go-to-market OEMs. So this is how we're able to really see the OEMs from a more holistic and not necessarily an impartial view, but to give us that inside scoop to be able to see it in play. And then, of course, a real big differentiator is we're working with customers. We're developing case studies that influences our insights, because we're able to actually see, again, what's going on. But how did the customer like it? Were there any pain points? How did that deployment and implementation go? All of these verticals that we're seeing, how are those affecting the solution? So those are the types of research and insights we're doing that might be a little unique to, say, Gartner, for example. We're taking into consideration history. We're taking in consideration what's going on with customers, what's their pain points in this space. So there's a lot of additional research that not a lot of third-party other, I would say, researching tools would use. So that kind of makes us unique in this space. But I will say, basically, the knowledge that we're obtaining in this is developing our expertise. And if you are interested in actually seeing this, the actual documentation, research and insights, I will be giving that URL at the end of this as well. So when you're thinking about looking at OEMs in this space, especially around SSE and the SASE landscape, I think it's important to note the market is developing rapidly here, and you may have to have concessions. So because it is developing, and if you're coming from a traditional network approach, these architectural models are going to be a little bit different, but they're going to offer you a lot more features and tools and feature parity and richness than you probably realize. So it's important to note that when we are looking at vendors, we're actually reviewing them not just from our go-to-market, but we're watching a lot of OEMs in this space because it is ever evolving. So this is really our secret sauce, so to speak, of keeping a pulse on the market. We're meeting not just with our go-to-market OEMs, but we're actually speaking and watching all of the new emerging OEMs and OEMs that are wanting to establish a better footprint into this space. So how can we help you at WWT? I think one of the biggest things is having these industry insights conversations, starting with a briefing. And typically what that would be having a meeting with you and your organization, and we just talk about all of the insights with a briefing. We'll talk about our research and insights in depth. And then, of course, we could go into different paths like learning paths, for example, workshops. But the ultimate goal is we want to start with you. We want to have that introduction and understanding what's going on. How can we help you so that we can get you to a secure outcome? And there's a lot of different paths to get there. And we want to make sure that we're there with you on that journey. Because I have to say, SASE and SSE, it's not one of those solutions where you can just flip a light switch and you're done. This is one of those areas where it's very important to learn, to understand that with different OEMs, which one you want to select, maybe even do testing in our lab at WWT, and then to really see if we need to get into services and to get into getting to that point of a secure outcome. Now, to highlight the industry insights and learning paths, I did want to show that you can request to have a briefing of Security Access Service Edge or SASE and SSE. And this is the URL if you want to. And it would basically be about an hour, and we would cover what we're seeing in the market. It would cover kind of those mission critical outcomes we have seen for organizations, but it would also really just help understand how we can help you too. And this would also really bleed into other paths so that we can take with you. And that's another point I wanted to make. Some of those learning paths may actually be using our on-demand labs. I wish I had access to this early on in my career where I could just go in and test out cool new OEMs and have them be self-guided. And so you'll be able to do this at no cost, available pretty quickly, and you can actually get traffic generation. I think what's important too to note here is it's really nice to get stick time. If you're one of those people like me where you're a visual learner, this is very helpful. And we don't just have them around SASE and SSE. If you go onto our platform, we actually have a significant amount of labs out there. So make sure to go check that out, and you should see the URL at the bottom there. We also have a really cool thing called Cyber Range, which is a kind of a fun way to make cybersecurity not as scary. I think that's the biggest thing is there's a lot of fear in cybersecurity, making sure that you are staying vigilant because you don't want those attacks. You don't want those malicious actors to come into your network and do some pretty bad things. But what's fun about this cyber range is it's kind of like capture the flag. So definitely check that out if you're interested, and you can sign up for that. And then finally, there's a couple other points I wanted to make is our market scan. What we do a workshop with organizations to really align with what OEM would work well for them. So, and essentially what we would do is we would sit with you and your decision makers and really go through your requirements. I think what's important when you are making a selection in an OEM, an SSE or SASE OEM, is understanding what's important to you. When you're doing an RFI or any sort of session like this, typically that's not something that gets accounted for when you are doing a scoring exercise. So what is important to you is part of that weight, is part of our score that is also using and leveraging our research and insights. So essentially what we would do is we would work with you. We would try to help you down select to 2 or 3 OEMs, and maybe need to go into a lab or to do a further bake-off to really understand what OEM is going to fit for you. And that way you will have a better grasp of your use cases, and you'll have a better idea of what your expectations will be going forward on your journey into SASE and SSE. And I think it's also important to note too, if you do want to go into a hands-on testing, the ATC doesn't just offer bake-offs like I just described earlier. You could do lab as a service, meaning if you to select an OEM, you could go test just those features in our lab. So that functionality testing is amazing to have and you don't need to put that on your production environment. You could do that in our lab. And that way it just gives you that more, you know, comfortability in that selection, but also it can help you learn. It can help you plan as well. And speaking of that, it's also important to know part of this journey from OEM selection to testing in the lab is getting to services. I think one of the hardest parts too is that technical planning. I know when I was a security engineer, one of the things I worked significantly on with clients is designing, making sure that what we're going to deploy has a strategy behind it. So this is what our services can help you do. And because it part of this journey, everything that we do in the beginning builds on top of each other. So essentially, this journey isn't going to be siloed for you either. You're going to have a lot more optimized conversations, but we're also going to track and make sure that we are meeting your needs. And then finally, here's that slide I kind of mentioned about all the URLs that might be great to have. These are some great articles written by some of my favorite people, but also they are so helpful when you are trying to understand all the nuances to SASE and SSE. And definitely keep an eye out. We do have a topics page, so when you are there, you'll be able to follow and get alerted when there are new topics or new content coming. And then in conclusion, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to watch this. I hope you found it informative. And as I wrap up, I want to emphasize one big thing is how crucial it is to stay adaptable in the face of this huge evolving security landscape. Embracing change, I know is hard, but it's so essential part of your journey in cybersecurity. So staying up to date in the latest of deployments, especially in a dynamic space like SASE, can be challenging, but you're not alone at this. At WWT, we're here to support you every step of the way. Let's secure all together. So thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful day.